Circular reasoning. Circular reasoning is a fallacy in which an argument's conclusion is smuggled into its premises, so the argument ends up proving what it already assumes. Instead of offering independent support, the reasoning loops back on itself. The claim is true because the claim is true. In logic, this is often called begging the question, petitio principii, where the thing to be proved appears, sometimes plainly, sometimes disguised, in the very reasons offered for it. The core problem is not that circular arguments are invalid in a technical sense. Many are perfectly valid, because if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. The problem is epistemic. The premises give you no new reason to believe the conclusion. If you didn't already accept the claim, the argument will not move you rationally toward accepting it. It's like trying to climb to a higher floor by standing on your own shoulders. Circularity can be obvious when a statement is simply restated with different words. This policy is the best because it's superior, does no more work than the original claim. Often, though, the circle is subtler. The defendant is guilty because he's a criminal, assumes the very thing at issue, guilt, in calling him a criminal. Appeals to authority can hide the loop as well. God exists because the Bible says so, and the Bible is true because it is the Word of God. Each claim leans on the other, neither is supported by something independent. Definitions and emotionally loaded descriptions can make a circle feel persuasive. Calling a practice unnatural, and then concluding it is wrong because it's unnatural, treats your label as evidence. In advertising, brand X is trustworthy because it's the brand you can trust, is pure tautology dressed up as reassurance. In pseudoscience, this treatment works because it has therapeutic effects, gives a conclusion a cosmetic makeover and offers it back as a premise. Because circular arguments often hide the conclusion within the premises, they can be hard to spot. A practical test is to ask whether someone who doubts the conclusion could accept the premises without already giving the game away. If rejecting the conclusion would also force rejection of the key premise, the argument is likely circular. Another test is to look for truly independent lines of support, evidence, observations, or principles that do not rely on the claim's truth to be credible. It's also useful to distinguish circular reasoning from legitimate reliance on basic starting points. Every system of thought has axioms or methods that cannot themselves be proved by the same system without some regress. Not all appeals to fundamentals are viciously circular. For example, an argument can be rule circular when it uses a method to defend that method. Philosophers debate when, if ever, this is acceptable. The hallmark of the fallacy is not merely self-reference but the failure to provide any independent justification that could persuade a neutral evaluator. The phrase, begs the question, is often misused to mean, raises the question. In critical thinking, it specifically refers to this error of assuming what you're trying to prove. Keeping the term precise helps you diagnose the problem. When an argument begs the question, it hasn't earned its conclusion. The remedy is straightforward: ask for or supply premises that could stand on their own to a skeptic. Instead of, this policy is best because it's superior, point to comparative data, clear criteria, and outcomes that don't presuppose the policy's merit. Good reasoning moves outward to new support. Circular reasoning just walks in a tidy, convincing-sounding circle. Argument from ignorance. An argument from ignorance, also called argumentum ad ignorantiam, is a fallacy that treats a lack of evidence against a claim as if it were evidence for the claim, or vice versa. Its basic form is, you can't prove this is false, therefore it's true, or you can't prove this is true, therefore it's false. The flaw lies in mistaking the absence of proof for proof of the opposite, when in reality the absence of evidence may mean only that we don't yet have enough information to decide either way. The appeal is psychologically tempting because uncertainty is uncomfortable. People like to settle questions, and in the absence of conclusive evidence, they often reach for a decision by leaning on what isn't known. This is why debates about mysterious phenomena, UFOs, cryptids, conspiracy theories, often feature the line, "No one has disproved it," as if the inability to rule something out were the same as confirming it. But this ignores the possibility that the truth simply hasn't been discovered yet, or that our tools for investigation are still inadequate. The fallacy can also work in reverse, assuming that because something hasn't been proven true, it must be false. A common example appears in the history of science: no evidence shows that germs cause disease, so they don't. Before germ theory, the evidence simply wasn't available, but that absence did not mean the claim was false, only that it wasn't proven at the time. The danger here is that both forms of the fallacy can freeze inquiry. One side claims victory too soon, while the other dismisses possibilities prematurely. The structure of this fallacy depends on treating the current state of knowledge as complete. But in reality, most questions, especially in science, history, and philosophy, exist within a shifting landscape of evidence. What's missing today could appear tomorrow. That's why the more careful approach is to withhold judgment when the evidence is insufficient, rather than to declare the claim proved or disproved. This stance avoids both gullibility and unwarranted skepticism, keeping the focus on gathering relevant facts. There are limited contexts where the absence of evidence can legitimately count as evidence of absence, but these require strong conditions. You have to be in a position where you would almost certainly have the evidence if the claim were true. For example, if someone says there's an elephant in the room, and you've just looked carefully in a well-lit space and found nothing, the lack of evidence is indeed a reason to think there is no elephant. Without such conditions, visibility, proper search, reliable detection, the inference becomes the fallacy. In sound reasoning, not knowing is not a flaw, it's an honest recognition of uncertainty. The proper response to an argument from ignorance is to point out that the truth of the matter cannot be determined solely by what hasn't been shown yet, and to shift the discussion toward what evidence could actually bear on the claim. That way, ignorance becomes a motivation for inquiry, not a tool for premature conclusion. False analogy. The false analogy fallacy occurs when an argument relies on a comparison between two things that are superficially similar but fundamentally different in relevant ways. Analogies can be powerful tools for explanation and persuasion, helping to clarify complex concepts by drawing parallels to familiar experiences. However, when the similarities are exaggerated or the differences overlooked, the analogy becomes misleading, and any conclusions drawn from it are logically unreliable. In a false analogy, the arguer assumes that because two things share one or more characteristics, they must share others as well, without adequately establishing that the shared traits are relevant to the point being made. For example, someone might argue that because both cars and bicycles have wheels, regulating car traffic should follow the same rules as bicycle traffic. While the analogy highlights a superficial similarity, it ignores critical differences in size, speed, safety, and infrastructure requirements, making the comparison inappropriate as a basis for policy. The flaw lies not in the recognition of similarity, but in overstating its significance for the conclusion. This fallacy often appears in persuasive rhetoric, advertising, and political discourse because analogies are intuitively compelling and easy to grasp. By framing an issue in terms of a familiar scenario, speakers can evoke agreement or emotional resonance, even if the comparison is logically unsound. The danger is that audiences may accept the conclusion without critically evaluating whether the similarities cited are truly relevant, allowing a weak or flawed argument to seem persuasive. Identifying a false analogy requires careful examination of the relationship between the compared entities. One must ask whether the similarities cited are essential to the argument and whether important differences have been ignored. A sound analogy depends on relevant parallels, not merely on superficial or coincidental features. The more critical the differences to the point being argued, the weaker the analogy becomes and the more likely the argument is fallacious. Ultimately, the false analogy fallacy misleads by presenting an inappropriate comparison as if it were evidence. While analogies can illuminate ideas, they cannot substitute for direct reasoning or factual support. Logical rigor demands that comparisons be relevant, accurate, and proportionate, Otherwise, the argument risks collapsing under scrutiny, no matter how persuasive the analogy may appear at first glance. Red herring. The red herring fallacy occurs when an argument introduces an irrelevant topic or distraction to divert attention from the issue at hand. Instead of addressing the original question or claim, the arguer shifts focus to a tangential point, creating the illusion of engagement while avoiding substantive discussion. This tactic often exploits the natural tendency of audiences to follow new or emotionally charged information, allowing the speaker to evade critical scrutiny or to manipulate the direction of the debate. A classic example is in a political debate where a candidate, asked about economic policy, responds by highlighting a personal scandal of their opponent. The new topic, personal behavior, may be provocative or interesting, but it is logically irrelevant to the question of policy competence. Similarly, in everyday conversation, someone might sidestep a critique of their own behavior by raising an unrelated complaint, steering the discussion away from their accountability. In each case, the red herring functions as a diversion, not as an answer or evidence supporting the original claim. Red herrings are effective because human attention is easily drawn to salient or emotionally engaging information. By introducing a striking or provocative point, the arguer can shift the focus of the audience, causing them to lose track of the original argument. Unlike outright falsehoods, red herrings are often truthful or reasonable on their own, which makes them especially deceptive. The new information seems relevant, but it does not address the actual question. This subtlety distinguishes the red herring from other fallacies that rely on clear misrepresentation or error. Recognizing a red herring involves carefully tracking the relevance of each point to the original issue. Critical evaluation asks whether the response directly addresses the claim or question, or whether it merely sidesteps it by introducing an unrelated topic. Awareness of this fallacy is crucial for productive debate and rational discourse, because it allows participants to identify when an argument is being deflected rather than genuinely answered. In essence, the red herring fallacy relies on distraction and misdirection. It may shift attention effectively, but it does not provide logical support for the original claim. Avoiding this fallacy requires vigilance in keeping discussions focused, ensuring that each point bears directly on the issue at hand rather than leading the conversation astray with tangential or emotionally charged diversions. Gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy is a logical error that arises when someone assumes that past random events influence the likelihood of future random events, even though each event is statistically independent. It reflects a misunderstanding of probability, where patterns are imagined in sequences that are actually governed by chance. People committing this fallacy believe that deviations from expected outcomes will correct themselves in the short term, leading them to make predictions or decisions based on erroneous assumptions about probability. A classic example of the gambler's fallacy occurs in casino gambling. If a roulette wheel lands on red 5 times in a row, a player might assume that black is due on the next spin. In reality, each spin is independent, and the probability of red or black remains the same regardless of prior outcomes. The fallacy stems from the human tendency to see patterns and impose a sense of balance or fairness on randomness, a cognitive bias known as the law of small numbers. This bias leads individuals to overestimate the likelihood of reversals in purely random processes. The gambler's fallacy can also appear outside of gambling in everyday decision-making. For instance, someone might believe that after several rainy days, a sunny day is inevitable, or that a coin that has landed heads several times is more likely to land tails on the next flip. In each case, the error arises from treating independent events as if they were causally connected, assuming that chance remembers previous outcomes. Understanding this fallacy requires recognizing that in truly random processes, the probability of each event is fixed and unaffected by prior results. Past events do not accumulate or create a compensatory force. Randomness does not self-correct over small sequences. The gambler's fallacy demonstrates how intuitive notions of fairness and balance can mislead reasoning, making people vulnerable to poor decisions based on imagined trends. In essence, the gambler's fallacy misinterprets chance, projecting patterns onto random events that have no inherent connection. Sound reasoning about probability requires treating each event independently and evaluating outcomes based on actual statistical likelihood, rather than on perceived streaks or imagined balancing effects. False dilemma. A false dilemma is a mistake in reasoning where a complex matter is presented as if there are only two mutually exclusive, exhaustive options, one to embrace and one to reject, when in fact there are other possibilities. The form is familiar: you're either with us or against us, either we cut all funding or the budget will collapse, either technology saves us or humanity is doomed. By squeezing a spectrum into two boxes, the arguer makes their preferred option look inevitable and the alternative look absurd. This move is persuasive because it simplifies uncertainty. People like crisp choices, and binary framing creates urgency: choose now, pick a side. It also lets a speaker smuggle in a value judgment. If the two options are described as freedom versus chaos, or protecting children versus censorship, the language nudges the audience toward one horn of the supposed dilemma. In everyday debates, politics, ethics, workplace decisions, the false dilemma trades nuance for momentum, making it appear that indecision equals failure. Not every two-option argument is fallacious. Some choices are structurally binary: a light is on or off, a contract is signed or not signed, a proposition in classical logic is true or false under a fixed interpretation. Even in practical matters, constraints can make a decision temporarily binary: we have cash for either Project A or Project B this quarter. The fallacy arises when the options presented are not truly exhaustive or not mutually exclusive, or when the framing ignores compromise positions, conditional plans, or uncertainty. For example, between ban cars and do nothing about emissions, there are policies like phased standards, congestion pricing, electrification, and better transit. These mixed strategies are neither the extreme nor its negation. You can spot false dilemmas by listening for all or nothing cues: either, must, only, with us or against us, especially when the topic obviously admits gradations or combinations. Ask whether the options are both mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. If not, more boxes belong on the table. Consider whether time matters: a staged approach, trial period, or both now, differently later option often dissolves the supposed bind. Also beware of loaded false dilemmas that quietly change the question: either you support this bill or you don't care about safety. Swaps a policy debate for a moral test of character. A related pitfall is the gray fallacy: noticing that a black and white frame is wrong and then assuming the truth must lie exactly in the middle. Sometimes one extreme really is correct, sometimes the best answer sits off-center or outside the proposed line entirely. The cure for black and white thinking isn't automatic compromise, it's accurate mapping of the option space and clear criteria for choosing among the real alternatives. To counter a false dilemma in discussion, resist the forced choice. Reconstruct the issue in its strongest, most precise form and surface the missing possibilities: intermediate policies, hybrid solutions, different decision criteria, or decide later with more evidence. If the arguer claims the set is exhaustive, ask them to justify that claim. If they assert mutual exclusivity, probe for ways the options could coexist. Good reasoning widens the frame before it narrows the decision. Slippery slope. A slippery slope argument warns that taking a seemingly small first step will set off a chain of events that ends in something extreme or disastrous. It becomes a fallacy when that chain is asserted rather than shown, when inevitability is suggested without a credible mechanism, realistic probabilities, or attention to the forces that would slow, stop, or reverse the descent. The rhetorical shape is familiar: if we allow this exception, standards will crumble; if we pass this policy, tyranny is next. The conclusion feels urgent because it trades on fear and the intuition that trends accelerate, but intuition is not evidence. There are two broad flavors. In a causal slippery slope, the claim is that one action directly increases the likelihood of the next. If students turn in one late assignment without penalty, deadlines will cease to matter, and soon no one will meet them. In a conceptual or precedent-based slope, the worry is that drawing a boundary here makes it hard to resist slightly further cases later. If we make an exception in this medical case, where do we draw the line next time? Both can be legitimate cautions. They become fallacious when the causal links are speculative, the can't draw a line point ignores workable criteria, or the argument treats first step as tantamount to no way back. What makes slippery slope reasoning seductive is that slopes sometimes do exist, incentives compound, precedents migrate, institutions can ratchet. That's precisely why the standard for a good slope argument is evidence, not imagery. A sound version specifies 1. The mechanism that connects each step, 2. The base rates, how often similar steps have led further in the real world, 3. The frictions and guardrails that resist movement, rules, norms, review processes, and 4. The reversibility of early steps. If we change grading policy A, past changes of this type at our school increased late submissions by 8 to 10%, and the proposed policy removes the only enforcement mechanism, is an argument. This will destroy education, is theater. Common fallacious cues include absolutist language, inevitably, next thing you know, long chains with weak middle links, leaps from modest change to maximal outcome with no intermediate analysis, and the neglect of countervailing forces, oversight, public backlash, legal limits, cost, or practical constraints. The pattern often travels with other errors: false dilemma framing, either stop X now or accept catastrophe, appeal to fear, or hasty generalization from a single anecdote. It helps to distinguish slippery slopes from nearby issues. The Sorites heap paradoxes about vagueness, when small changes don't seem to make a difference but many do, whereas a slippery slope is about causal progression or norm diffusion. Likewise, warning about path dependence or ratchet effects can be perfectly legitimate if grounded in evidence about how rules and incentives actually work in a domain. To evaluate a slope claim, ask concrete questions. What exactly makes step 1 increase the probability of step 2? By how much? Are the steps truly dependent, or could we adopt the first while explicitly forbidding the second? What safeguards exist now, and what new ones could be added? Are there historical cases that match the relevant features, not just superficial analogies? How costly would it be to monitor and reverse course after the first step? A slope with identifiable mechanisms, realistic probabilities, and absent guardrails might warrant concern. Lacking those, it's a scare tactic. To answer a slippery slope in discussion, refuse the rush to the bottom. Reframe the issue at the present step, supply workable boundaries. Here's the criterion that admits this case but excludes the next, and propose guardrails, sunset clauses, audits, pilot programs, explicit exceptions that break the supposed inevitability. Good reasoning doesn't deny that slopes can exist. It demands we map the terrain, measure the angle, and install handrails before declaring that one step sends us sliding. Hasty generalization. Hasty generalization is the mistake of leaping from too little evidence to a broad conclusion. It's an error in inductive reasoning. You observe a few cases, often vivid, recent, or convenient, and infer a rule about a whole group, trend, or phenomenon. The problem isn't that generalizing is always wrong. We have to generalize to navigate the world. The problem is the hasty part. The sample is too small, too narrow, or too biased to justify the scope of the claim. This fallacy thrives on anecdotes. 2 rude tourists do not make a nation rude. A product that failed twice for you is not necessarily junk for everyone. A sensational news story about a crime committed by a member of Group X does not license conclusions about Group X as a whole. Social media amplifies this because striking examples are easy to recall and share, while dull, typical cases are invisible. What feels like evidence is often just an eye-catching exception. Under the hood, Several cognitive habits feed hasty generalization. The availability heuristic makes memorable cases feel common. The representativeness heuristic tempts us to treat a small sample as if it mirrored the population. Confirmation bias nudges us to notice supporting instances and ignore counterexamples. We're also bad at the law of small numbers. Small samples wobble, they produce streaks and outliers, and we overread them as patterns. Methodology matters. An adequate generalization needs not only enough cases but the right kind. Convenient samples, your friends, your customers who complained, respondents to an online poll, rarely represent the broader population. Self-selection skews who shows up in your data. A truncated time window mistakes a blip for a trend. Even large samples can mislead if they're systematically biased. Good inductive reasoning pays attention to base rates, variability, and how the data were gathered. It helps to separate reasonable caution from overreach. Saying, "In my experience, the service has been slow this week," is a modest claim tied to a clear scope. Saying, "This company is always slow," on the same evidence overstates what you know. Scientists hedge for a reason. They speak in terms of estimates, margins of error, and confidence because data always come with uncertainty. The more sweeping the claim, the stronger and more representative the evidence must be. There are edge cases. A single observation can sometimes be decisive, but usually only for narrow, universal claims under strict conditions. The discovery of one black swan falsifies, all swans are white, but it doesn't justify, most swans are black. Similarly, a single well-documented failure might warrant recalling a product batch if there's a strong mechanism linking the case to a systemic defect. These aren't hasty, they rely on theory and diagnostic evidence, not mere vividness. To avoid the fallacy, slow the inference down. Ask what population you're really talking about and whether the evidence represents it. Consider how many cases you have, how they were selected, over what period, and what the plausible base rates are. Look for counterexamples and for data that could disconfirm your hunch. When the evidence is thin, scale back the claim or hold it tentatively. Induction is a powerful tool, but only when you let the data set the size of your conclusions. Ad hominem. An ad hominem is a logical fallacy in which someone tries to undermine a claim by attacking the person making it rather than addressing the claim itself. The move shifts attention from reasons and evidence to the speaker's character, motives, background, or associations. It's seductive because it feels like progress. Discredit the messenger and you've discredited the message, but the truth or falsity of a proposition doesn't hinge on who states it. Even a flawed or biased person can make a sound argument, and a virtuous person can make a bad one. Ad hominem comes in several familiar guises. The abusive version takes aim at character: "You're an idiot, so your view on taxes is worthless." The circumstantial version points to someone's situation or interests: "Of course she supports renewable subsidies, she works in solar," implying bias rather than engaging the merits. Tu quoque, you too, alleges hypocrisy: "You say smoking is harmful, yet you used to smoke," confusing the speaker's inconsistency with the quality of the evidence. Guilt by association discredits a view because an unsavory group shares it, and poisoning the well tries to preemptively taint anything an opponent might say by casting suspicion on them before they speak. All of these are relevance errors. They substitute facts about a person for reasons about the claim. Not every remark about a person is fallacious. Context matters. When the issue is testimony, expertise, or trust, information about credibility is directly relevant. If we must rely on an expert's judgment, their training, track record, and conflicts of interest legitimately bear on how much weight to give their assertions. Likewise in court, a witness's reliability can be probed. The fallacy arises when personal facts are used to avoid engaging the argument's content, or when the only reason offered against a claim is something about the claimant. Ad hominem reasoning corrodes discussion because it invites tribal reflexes and discourages charitable listening. It often travels with other fallacies, red herrings that distract from the point, or the genetic fallacy, judging a claim solely by its origin. It's especially common in politics and online debate, where quick hits feel rewarding, but it short-circuits the slow work of comparing evidence, clarifying terms, and testing logic. To recognize and defuse it, separate people from propositions. Ask, if this claim were made anonymously, would the reason still stand? Restate the opponent's point in its strongest fair form, then respond to the reasons, not the resume. If bias is relevant, name it precisely and explain how it affects the evidence, rather than letting it substitute for a rebuttal. In good argument, character may set the stage, it should never be the script. Faulty comparison. A faulty comparison is a reasoning error that occurs when two things are compared in a way that ignores important differences, exaggerates superficial similarities, or draws a conclusion that the comparison cannot actually support. At its core, the fallacy assumes that because two subjects share some traits, they must be alike in other respects, or that the differences between them are irrelevant to the conclusion being drawn. The flaw lies not in making comparisons. Comparison is a normal and often essential part of reasoning, but in using them carelessly, without ensuring that the analogy is relevant, proportionate, and grounded in the right kind of similarity. This fallacy often appears in arguments that try to persuade by analogy. If the analogy is weak, because the shared traits are trivial or the differences are critical, then the argument collapses. For example, claiming employees are like nails, they must be hit on the head to work, draws on one superficial feature, both can be set into motion by external force, while ignoring profound differences in nature, motivation, and dignity. The conclusion about how to treat employees cannot be justified by this crude analogy, because the relevant characteristics that matter for workplace motivation are nothing like those of inanimate objects. Faulty comparisons can also arise when differences are ignored between contexts that look alike on the surface. A policy that works in a small, homogeneous country might be assumed to work in a vast, diverse one because both are countries, overlooking differences in scale, culture, infrastructure, and governance that may be decisive. Similarly, comparing the human brain to a computer can be useful for illustrating certain processes, but using that analogy to claim the brain literally stores memories as files and folders misleads by overstating the match and ignoring how biological memory actually works. The persuasiveness of faulty comparisons often comes from their intuitive appeal. Humans are pattern-seeking, and analogies are shortcuts for understanding new or complex ideas. A clever analogy can feel right even when it is logically thin. This is why advertising frequently leans on faulty comparisons. This luxury watch is like owning a private jet, trades on the shared symbolism of status and exclusivity, while ignoring that the two products differ entirely in purpose, function, and scale of value. In political rhetoric, such comparisons can be even more dangerous, as they may distort public understanding of an issue by equating it with something emotionally charged but structurally different. Not all comparisons are faulty. Analogies are legitimate when they are relevant and proportionate. A strong analogy depends on shared characteristics that are directly linked to the point being argued and on differences that do not undermine the inference. The best way to avoid the fallacy is to test the analogy. Ask whether the similarities are truly relevant to the conclusion, whether the differences weaken the connection, and whether the comparison is being stretched beyond its justified scope. If the traits compared are superficial or irrelevant, or if the differences are more significant than the similarities, the argument is not strengthened by the analogy, it is only dressed up by it. Would you like me to also write a mirror explanation of this for the related fallacy, false analogy, which is often confused with faulty comparison? That way you can see the subtle difference between them. False balance. False balance is a distortion in reasoning and communication that occurs when two opposing viewpoints are presented as if they have equal weight, merit, or evidentiary support, even when one is overwhelmingly backed by facts and the other is not. It often arises from a misguided attempt to appear fair, objective, or neutral, treating both sides as equally valid regardless of the actual balance of evidence. While the intention may be to avoid bias, the effect is to create a misleading sense of parity between unequal claims. This fallacy is particularly visible in journalism, where reporters may feel compelled to give equal time to opposing perspectives in order to avoid accusations of partisanship. For example, a scientific consensus about the dangers of smoking or the reality of climate change may be set against the opinion of a small minority who deny the evidence, with both framed as if they were equally credible positions. The problem is not in acknowledging dissenting voices, but in presenting them without the necessary context, such as the overwhelming body of research supporting one side and the lack of empirical support for the other. False balance can also appear in personal or political discussions. Someone might say, well, we'll just have to agree there are two equally valid opinions, when in fact one of those opinions rests on demonstrably false premises. The reasoning mistake lies in assuming that fairness means treating all views as equally plausible, when fairness in truth-seeking actually means weighing claims according to the strength and reliability of their supporting evidence. The appeal of false balance is that it feels even-handed and non-confrontational. People may believe that by giving both sides equal space, they are fostering open-mindedness. In reality, doing so without regard to the quality of evidence elevates misinformation and can erode public understanding. In domains like health, law, and public policy, this can have serious consequences, delaying action, sowing unnecessary doubt, and lending legitimacy to fringe or harmful positions. Avoiding the false balance fallacy requires distinguishing between fairness in representation and accuracy in evaluation. It is possible to acknowledge minority viewpoints while making clear how they compare to the weight of evidence and expert consensus. True balance is achieved by proportionally representing the credibility of different perspectives, not by artificially giving them equal standing. In essence, false balance is the illusion of impartiality that emerges when unequal claims are placed on equal footing. By prioritizing the appearance of fairness over the reality of truth, it obscures the actual distribution of evidence and can lead audiences to believe that genuine uncertainty exists where it does not. Appeal to nature. The appeal to nature fallacy occurs when something is claimed to be good, right, or desirable simply because it is natural, or conversely, bad or undesirable because it is unnatural. This type of reasoning assumes an intrinsic moral or practical value based solely on whether something occurs in nature or aligns with natural processes, without examining evidence, consequences, or context. The flaw lies in conflating descriptive statements about the natural world with prescriptive claims about how humans should behave or what is inherently correct. This fallacy is common in discussions about health, diet, medicine, and technology. For instance, one might argue that a herbal remedy is superior to modern pharmaceuticals because it is natural, or that genetically modified foods are inherently harmful because they are unnatural. While natural products can indeed be beneficial and human-made products can have risks, the mere fact of being natural or unnatural provides no guarantee of safety, efficacy, or morality. Poisonous mushrooms, venomous snakes, and natural diseases illustrate that not all natural things are good, just as artificial innovations can save lives and improve quality of life. The appeal to nature is persuasive because humans often associate nature with purity, simplicity, and wholesomeness, while perceiving human-made interventions as artificial, risky, or corrupt. These associations tap into deep-seated instincts and cultural narratives, giving the fallacy emotional and intuitive appeal even when it lacks logical support. However, moral or practical value cannot be inferred solely from origin or naturalness. Relevance, evidence, and reasoned evaluation must guide judgments instead. Detecting this fallacy involves asking whether the argument provides reasons beyond the label natural or unnatural. A critical thinker examines consequences, empirical evidence, and context rather than relying on simplistic appeals to nature. Statements like, "This is natural, therefore it is safe," or "This is unnatural, therefore it is wrong," should immediately prompt scrutiny, because they substitute a superficial criterion for actual justification. In essence, the appeal to nature fallacy conflates existence with correctness. Just because something occurs in the natural world, or is created by humans, does not determine its moral, practical, or scientific value. Sound reasoning requires evaluating claims based on evidence, logic, and outcomes, rather than on a vague or idealized notion of what is natural. Appeal to tradition. The appeal to tradition fallacy occurs when something is claimed to be true, correct, or better simply because it has been practiced or believed for a long time. The argument assumes that longevity alone confers validity, as if the age of an idea or custom is evidence of its inherent rightness. While traditions can indeed hold wisdom, the mere fact that something has always been done this way does not guarantee that it is logical, effective, or morally justified. This fallacy often appears in debates about social norms, laws, and cultural practices. For example, someone might oppose a new teaching method by arguing that, "We've taught this subject the same way for generations," or defend a social custom by stating, "It has always been part of our culture." Such reasoning bypasses the need to evaluate the actual merits or consequences of the tradition in question. Many long-standing practices, such as outdated medical treatments or discriminatory laws, persisted not because they were correct, but because they went unchallenged for centuries. The appeal to tradition is persuasive because traditions can provide stability, identity, and continuity, which people naturally value. Change can be uncomfortable or threatening, so framing an idea as part of an enduring heritage can make it seem safer or more trustworthy. However, the age of a belief or practice is not itself proof of its correctness. It is entirely possible for a flawed idea to persist for generations through inertia, social pressure, or lack of alternatives. Recognizing this fallacy requires separating the historical or cultural significance of a tradition from its logical or ethical soundness. A practice should be evaluated based on evidence, reasoning, and relevance to current conditions, rather than its historical endurance alone. Some traditions may indeed have valid reasons for continuing, but those reasons must be demonstrated rather than assumed on the basis of age. In essence, the appeal to tradition fallacy mistakes longevity for legitimacy. While traditions can carry valuable insights, their worth lies in their continued usefulness and alignment with sound reasoning, not merely in the fact that they have survived over time. Appeal to emotion. The appeal to emotion fallacy occurs when someone attempts to persuade an audience to accept a claim or take action by manipulating feelings rather than presenting relevant evidence or sound reasoning. Rather than relying on logical support, the argument seeks to trigger emotions such as fear, pity, anger, or pride to override critical thinking. While emotions naturally influence human judgment, relying solely on them as a basis for belief or action bypasses the rational evaluation necessary to determine whether a claim is actually true or a proposed course of action is justified. This fallacy manifests in a wide variety of contexts, from advertising to politics to interpersonal arguments. A charity advertisement, for instance, might show harrowing images of suffering children and implore viewers to donate, implying that failing to give would be morally wrong, without providing information about how donations will be used or the effectiveness of the charity. In politics, a speaker might claim that a policy must be enacted by invoking national pride or fear of a supposed threat, rather than offering evidence for the policy's benefits or practical feasibility. The technique is persuasive because emotions can strongly influence decision-making and can momentarily suspend critical analysis, but emotional impact does not equate to logical support. The appeal to emotion is particularly compelling because humans are wired to respond to effective cues. Fear, guilt, hope, or compassion can prompt immediate action or alignment with an idea, even in the absence of rational justification. This makes the fallacy effective in rhetoric, but it is inherently misleading. It encourages acceptance of claims without demanding verification or careful scrutiny. Recognizing the fallacy requires separating emotional response from evidential support and asking whether the argument provides facts, reasons, or logical connections that genuinely justify the conclusion. Importantly, appealing to emotion is not always inappropriate. Ethical persuasion often involves engaging the audience's feelings alongside reasoned argument. The fallacy arises only when emotion is used as a substitute for evidence or reasoning, rather than as a supplement. When an argument depends entirely on eliciting pity, fear, or outrage to compel agreement, it is logically flawed, because the emotional impact does not determine truth. In essence, the appeal to emotion fallacy substitutes feeling for reasoning, attempting to bypass critical thought by exploiting natural human reactions. While emotions can highlight the relevance or urgency of an issue, they cannot prove a claim. Sound reasoning requires that arguments be evaluated on evidence, logic, and coherence, not merely on the strength of the feelings they evoke. Argument from incredulity. The argument from incredulity fallacy occurs when someone rejects a claim or idea simply because they personally find it difficult to believe or understand. This reasoning assumes that if something seems implausible or beyond one's comprehension, it must therefore be false. Instead of engaging with the actual evidence or reasoning behind the claim, the person relies on their own sense of disbelief as the deciding factor. While skepticism can be healthy, disbelief rooted in personal limitations does not serve as proof against the truth of a proposition. This fallacy is common in discussions about science, history, and technology, fields where concepts can be counterintuitive or complex. For example, someone might say, "I can't imagine how the universe could have formed without a cause, so it must have been created by an intelligent being." Or, "I don't understand how evolution could produce complex life, so it can't be true." In both cases, the argument dismisses a possibility not because it has been disproven, but because the person's imagination or knowledge cannot accommodate it. The appeal of this fallacy lies in the comfort of familiar thinking. People naturally use intuition and personal experience to judge plausibility, but these mental shortcuts can fail when dealing with phenomena outside everyday life. Human intuition is poorly suited to grasping immense time scales, subatomic processes, or other realities that differ from ordinary experience. As a result, something can feel unbelievable while still being true, and conversely, something can feel entirely plausible while being false. Avoiding the argument from incredulity requires distinguishing between personal disbelief and objective evidence. One's inability to explain or imagine how something works should prompt curiosity and investigation, not outright dismissal. Sound reasoning acknowledges that lack of understanding is not proof of impossibility, and that truth exists independently of what feels intuitive. In essence, the argument from incredulity mistakes personal limits for universal limits. Disbelief alone is not evidence. Facts and logic must be evaluated on their own terms, even if they challenge our assumptions or stretch the boundaries of our imagination. Argument from personal experience. An argument from personal experience is the mistake of treating one's own direct encounters, anecdotes, or memories as sufficient proof for a broad claim, while disregarding the limits, biases, and unreliability of individual perception. It rests on the idea that because I saw, felt, or lived through something, that alone settles the question, often without considering whether the experience is representative, accurately interpreted, or even remembered correctly. Personal experience can be vivid and emotionally compelling, but in reasoning it is a fragile foundation for general conclusions. This fallacy often shows up in conversations that resist statistical or scientific evidence. Someone might say, "I know smoking can't be that bad, my grandfather smoked every day and lived to be 95, or, "I don't believe depression is real, I've felt sad before and just got over it." These statements elevate a single case, or a handful, above much broader evidence, implying that the small sample trumps more systematic data. The reasoning assumes that if something is true in one's personal world, it must be universally true, ignoring the role of luck, context, and variation. One reason this fallacy is so persuasive is that personal experience is immediate and concrete, while statistics and studies are abstract. A friend's story about a rare vaccine side effect can feel more real than a medical report showing such effects are vanishingly rare. Human memory and perception also bring their own distortions. Confirmation bias shapes what we notice and recall, selective memory edits events to fit our beliefs, and our interpretations of events are influenced by prior assumptions. Even honest testimony can be mistaken without anyone lying. It's important to note that personal experience is not worthless. In fact, it often plays a legitimate role in forming hypotheses, raising questions, or providing qualitative context. If you get food poisoning after eating at a restaurant, your experience is a valid reason to avoid that restaurant yourself. But as an argument for a general conclusion, that restaurant is unsafe for everyone or all sushi is dangerous, it fails without broader, corroborating evidence. Good reasoning treats personal experience as one piece of a larger puzzle, not the entire picture. The remedy for this fallacy is to ask, how typical is my experience? Could there be alternative explanations for what I observed? What would the larger sample or systematic data say? By placing individual experience alongside controlled studies, statistical trends, and multiple perspectives, you keep its narrative power without letting it distort the truth. In reasoning, I saw it may start the conversation, but it should never be the final word. Argument from silence. The argument from silence is a reasoning error in which someone draws a conclusion based on the absence of evidence or the failure of a source to mention something, treating that silence as if it were definitive proof. It assumes that if a claim were true, there would necessarily be a record, statement, or acknowledgement of it, and that the lack of such acknowledgement means the claim must be false, or, conversely, that it must be true. While silence can sometimes be meaningful in specific contexts, treating it as conclusive evidence is dangerous because there are often many reasons why something might not be mentioned or recorded. This fallacy often appears in historical debates. For example, a historian might argue that because an ancient chronicler never mentioned a particular event, the event must not have happened. But this assumes that the chronicler knew of the event, considered it worth recording, and had no constraints or biases affecting what they wrote. Similarly, in everyday life, someone might say, "You didn't deny it when I asked, so it must be true," or, "The report doesn't say the product is unsafe, so it must be completely safe." In both cases, silence is taken as direct confirmation or refutation, even though the silence may be due to ignorance, irrelevance, oversight, or deliberate omission. The appeal of the argument from silence lies in its simplicity. It feels intuitive to think that important truths naturally announce themselves or that significant events will leave obvious traces. But the world is messier than that. Records can be lost, communication can fail, priorities can differ, and people may deliberately withhold information for personal, political, or cultural reasons. The absence of mention is not the same as the absence of reality. To avoid falling into this fallacy, it is important to distinguish between situations where silence is genuinely informative and where it is not. Silence can be meaningful when there is strong reason to believe that, if something were true, there would almost certainly be evidence of it, such as in well-documented legal proceedings or rigorous scientific testing. However, outside of such tightly controlled circumstances, silence should be treated as neutral rather than decisive. At its core, the argument from silence turns a lack of evidence into evidence of lack without carefully considering other possible explanations. Sound reasoning demands that conclusions be grounded in positive, substantive evidence rather than in the empty spaces where we wish evidence would be. Composition fallacy. The composition fallacy is the error of assuming that what is true of parts must be true of the whole they make up. It trades on an unnoticed shift between a property that applies distributively to individual members and a property that applies collectively to the group or structure. The move feels natural. If each component has a virtue, why wouldn't the assembled thing inherit it? But many properties don't scale that way, and interactions among parts often change the picture. You can see the mistake in familiar settings. A team of star players is not automatically a great team. Coordination, roles, and style matter, and strengths can clash. A machine built from very light components can still be heavy once you add hundreds of them plus fasteners, casing, and fluids. If every step in a plan has a small risk, the plan as a whole may have a large risk because small probabilities accumulate. Even in finance, buying several good stocks does not guarantee a safe portfolio if those stocks are tightly correlated. The whole inherits their shared vulnerabilities rather than their individual quality. In science, atoms are invisible, therefore anything made of atoms is invisible, fails because visibility is an emergent property of aggregated matter, not a property of single atoms. Not all inferences from parts to wholes are fallacious. Some properties do aggregate monotonically or by clear rules. If every tile on a mosaic is red and the tiles fully cover the surface, the mosaic is red. If each component weighs at least 1 kilogram, the assembled device weighs at least 1 kilogram, and in fact the weights add. The difference is that redness under full coverage and weight are preserved by composition, while qualities like fast, safe, efficient, strong, cheap, or effective often depend on arrangement, interactions, thresholds, and system-level constraints. The fallacy persists because our intuitions favor linear scaling and because we often overgeneralize from local knowledge. We notice the virtue of a part and project it upward, ignoring side effects, bottlenecks, diminishing returns, and coordination costs. Systems thinking is the antidote. Before inferring from parts to whole, ask whether the property is additive, averageable, or preserved under combination. Consider whether combining parts introduces conflicts or nonlinearities, and look for evidence at the level of the whole rather than assuming it from the level below. It also helps to keep the mirror image error in mind. The fallacy of division assumes what's true of the whole is true of each part. Both mistakes come from sliding between levels without checking whether the property survives the move. When arguments rely on composition, they should make explicit why the property should carry over, by pointing to a mechanism, a conservation law, or a structural reason, rather than merely restating the part-level fact. Without that bridge, the inference is a comforting shortcut, not a reasoned conclusion. Confusing correlation with causation. Confusing correlation with causation is the error of assuming that because two events or variables occur together, one must directly cause the other. In other words, the presence of a statistical or observed relationship, correlation, is taken as proof of a cause and effect link. This leap feels intuitive because our brains are wired to seek patterns and explanations. When two things line up, it's tempting to treat the connection as a story with one thing making the other happen. But correlation alone cannot tell us the direction of influence, whether there's any direct influence at all, or whether both variables are driven by some third factor. This fallacy appears in many forms. Sometimes it's a simple temporal assumption. After the city installed new streetlights, crime decreased, therefore, the streetlights caused the drop. The two trends may align, but perhaps the crime drop was due to unrelated policing changes, demographic shifts, or economic improvements. Other times the assumption is reversed. People who drink more coffee have higher productivity, so coffee must make people more productive. It might be that productive people drink more coffee because they work longer hours, not that coffee causes productivity. And sometimes both variables are effects of a hidden cause. Ice cream sales and drowning deaths both rise in summer, so ice cream causes drowning. In reality, hot weather increases both swimming and ice cream consumption without one causing the other. The error persists partly because correlations can be vivid and persuasive, especially when the relationship fits an existing belief or desire. News headlines often rely on this. Study finds that people who eat chocolate live longer, inviting readers to treat the correlation as an indulgent prescription. But in research, correlation is a starting point for investigation, not the finish line. Establishing causation requires ruling out alternative explanations, identifying plausible mechanisms, and, ideally, running controlled experiments that manipulate one variable and track changes in the other. There are legitimate ways to link correlation to causation, but they demand more rigor than the fallacy allows. Longitudinal studies, randomized controlled trials, and sophisticated statistical controls can strengthen causal claims by accounting for confounding variables and demonstrating consistent, directional effects. Without these, a correlation might be suggestive, worth exploring, or relevant for prediction, but it cannot by itself justify a causal conclusion. Avoiding the fallacy means treating correlation as a clue, not a verdict. Before inferring causation, ask, could the relationship be reversed? Could both variables be influenced by something else? Has the possibility of coincidence been considered? And most importantly, is there independent evidence, mechanistic, experimental, or otherwise, that supports the claim of causality? Clear reasoning recognizes that while all causal relationships produce correlations, not all correlations reflect a causal relationship. Mistaking one for the other turns a pattern into a premature, and often wrong, story about cause and effect. Division fallacy. The division fallacy is the error of assuming that a property of a whole must also hold for each of its parts. It's the mirror image of the composition fallacy. Instead of projecting qualities up from components to the system, division projects them down from the system to its members. At heart, the mistake confuses aggregate or collective features with features that apply to individual elements. It treats the group as a simple magnifying glass that reveals identical traits in every piece rather than as a configuration whose overall character can differ radically from that of any single component. You see the error in everyday reasoning when someone says, the company is very profitable, so every employee must be well paid, or that novel is brilliant, therefore every chapter is brilliant, or the soup is hot, so every spoonful will burn you. None of those follow automatically. A firm's profits can be concentrated in one division, a novel can have a few standout chapters and several weak ones, and a pot of hot soup can contain cooler pockets. The fallacy also appears in more consequential contexts, treating a nation's high GDP as evidence that every citizen flourishes, or assuming because a chemical mixture is toxic that each ingredient is toxic on its own. Not every downward inference is wrong. Some properties distribute naturally. Mass, for example, is conserved and can be apportioned among parts, and if every tile of a floor is ceramic, the floor is ceramic throughout. The difference is whether the property is intrinsic and additive, or emergent and relational. Emergent properties, like cohesive team, delicious stew, robust financial system, or highly correlated portfolio, depend on interactions, arrangement, thresholds, or averages, and they may vanish or reverse at the level of individual parts. Statistical summaries can be especially treacherous. A high group average doesn't mean every member exceeds that average. Psychologically, division is tempting because humans like simple transfers and explanations. It's an easy shortcut to move from what's visible at the macro level to claims about micro-level reality. In statistics and social science, this impulse shows up as the ecological fallacy, drawing conclusions about individuals from aggregate data, while in ordinary life it fuels stereotyping and overconfident extrapolation. The antidote is to ask whether the property in question is logically or mechanistically transferable, to check for direct evidence about the parts, and to be wary of conflating averages with universals. Where possible, look for disaggregated data, examine causal pathways, and remember that wholes can have properties that their parts do not. Equivocation. The equivocation fallacy occurs when a key term or phrase in an argument is used in multiple senses, leading to a misleading or invalid conclusion. By subtly shifting the meaning of a word or concept partway through reasoning, the arguer creates the illusion of logical coherence while actually committing a semantic sleight of hand. Because the argument depends on the ambiguity rather than consistent definitions, the conclusion does not follow from the premises in any rigorous sense, even though it may appear superficially persuasive. This fallacy often appears when words with multiple meanings are exploited, sometimes deliberately and sometimes unintentionally. For example, consider an argument that claims, a feather is light. What is light cannot be dark. Therefore, a feather cannot be dark. Here, the word light shifts from meaning not heavy to not dark in color. The argument seems plausible at a glance but collapses under scrutiny because the term has changed sense midstream. Equivocation can also occur with more abstract concepts, such as freedom, justice, or nature, where the ambiguity of meaning allows speakers to slide from one interpretation to another, misleading the audience without overtly stating falsehoods. The danger of equivocation lies in its subtlety. It exploits the fact that language is inherently flexible and that audiences often assume terms retain the same meaning throughout an argument. This makes it easy to accept the conclusion intuitively, even though the reasoning is logically flawed. In rhetoric, equivocation can be persuasive, because the shift in meaning is often not immediately apparent, and the audience may be more focused on emotional resonance or ideological alignment than semantic precision. Avoiding the fallacy requires careful attention to the terms used in an argument. Each key word or phrase should retain a consistent meaning from premise to conclusion. When ambiguity is unavoidable, it must be explicitly acknowledged, and reasoning should account for the different possible interpretations. Critical thinking involves asking whether the same term is being used consistently or whether the argument relies on a covert shift in meaning to reach its conclusion. In essence, equivocation misleads by taking advantage of linguistic ambiguity. The argument appears valid only because the audience is not aware that the meaning of a term has changed. True logical rigor demands that definitions remain stable, or that any shifts in meaning are clearly stated and justified, rather than allowing a semantic trick to masquerade as sound reasoning. Loaded question. A loaded question is a rhetorical trick and a logical misstep in which a question covertly contains a controversial or disputed assumption, so that any direct answer appears to accept that assumption. The injustice of the move isn't in asking something that's hard to answer, it's in smuggling a premise into the question itself so that a simple yes or no will commit you to something you may not have agreed to. Classic examples make this painfully clear. Asking, "Have you stopped taking bribes?" presumes that the person ever took bribes. Answering yes or no implicitly endorses that hidden claim. The structure is simple but powerful. The question embeds proposition P, and a straightforward answer would thereby endorse P even though P may be exactly what's in dispute. What makes loaded questions so effective in debate, interviews, and politics is their ability to shift the burden of proof. Instead of forcing the asker to establish the controversial claim, the question forces the respondent into defensiveness or forced admissions. Often the question also dresses the presupposition in emotionally charged language, calling a policy corrupt or a person irresponsible, so that the accepted premise does rhetorical work beyond mere assertion. It frames the respondent negatively even if the presupposition lacks independent support. Because questions usually sound neutral and simple, audiences can miss the smuggling and interpret any answer as an admission. Logically, the fallacy matters because an answer to a loaded question is not an independent piece of evidence for the embedded claim. It's only persuasive insofar as the audience accepts the question's premise. That's why pointing out the presupposition matters. It restores the fair sequence of argument, where contested claims must be established before they are used as the basis for further questions. There is an important caveat: if the presupposed proposition has already been independently established, say, by prior admission, forensic evidence, or a clear contract, then the question is no longer fallacious in the same way. It may be blunt or aggressive, but it no longer forces an unfair commitment because the embedded premise is already on the table. Defending against a loaded question means refusing the covert bargain. A direct way to do that is to reject or question the assumed proposition, calling it out and asking for support. Saying, "That assumes X, which is false," or, "You're presupposing Y, do you have evidence for that?" converts the interaction back into an argument about facts rather than a trap. Another tactic is to reframe the question and answer conditionally. "If you mean whether I ever did X, the answer is, or, I won't accept the premise, here's what actually happened. These responses deny the implicit admission a trap-seeking question seeks to extract and force the asker to make their claim explicit and defend it. Because loaded questions are both logical and rhetorical, recognizing them requires careful listening. Look for verbs and phrasings that imply a past behavior or a settled fact. When did you stop? Why do you continue to? How long have you been? And ask whether that implication actually stands on independent evidence. Calling out the presupposition isn't merely nitpicky sophistry, it's a basic fairness test in discourse. When you point it out calmly and demand clarity, you deprive the tactic of its unfair power and move the exchange back toward genuine argumentation rather than baiting. Moving the goalposts. Moving the goalposts is a rhetorical and logical sleight of hand in which someone changes the criteria for success or proof after those criteria have already been met or after evidence has been produced, deliberately ensuring that the other party can never satisfy the demand. Instead of acknowledging the original evidence or conceding a point when it has been shown, the arguer raises new standards, requires different kinds of proof, or reframes what counts as a victory so that the original claim remains safe from refutation. The result is an argument that is not so much contested as rendered unfalsifiable. You see this tactic in everyday conversations, in online debates, and in professional settings. A person might say, "Show me that your method works," and then, when a clear demonstration is provided, insist that the demonstration wasn't rigorous enough and demand a different experiment. A critic might respond to a list of qualifying counterexamples by saying those don't count, and when you supply further evidence, reply with yet another disqualifier. Sometimes the change is subtle, an extra condition quietly appended to the original requirement, and sometimes it is blatant, shifting from one standard to another in order to avoid having to revise a belief. The effect is the same. The interlocutor never admits that the original challenge has been met because the target keeps moving. What makes moving the goalposts fallacious is that it substitutes rhetorical victory for logical engagement. Arguments are meant to proceed on stable premises and agreed standards for evidence. When those standards are altered ad hoc to protect a claim, the outcome is guaranteed rather than discovered. The maneuver also improperly shifts the burden of proof. Instead of the claimant meeting a single, reasonable standard, the respondent can demand an endless sequence of ever stricter demonstrations, which is not a mode of rational inquiry but of exhaustion and evasion. In practice, this undermines honest debate, it punishes thoroughness and rewards bad faith persistence. There are psychological forces behind the tactic. People naturally want to avoid being wrong, so they may raise the bar instead of revising a cherished belief. Social and identity pressures, wanting to defend a group, ideology, or reputation, can make moving the goalposts feel protective. Rhetorically, it is effective because it frustrates opponents and spectators. A never-satisfied skeptic can manufacture doubt indefinitely, and many listeners will grow tired or confused and stop pressing the issue. Distinguishing illegitimate goalpost moving from legitimate demands is important. It is reasonable to refine methods, demand higher quality evidence for stronger claims, or change standards when new information about error sources emerges. Science routinely raises evidentiary bars as methods and stakes change. The fallacy occurs when changes are introduced after evidence is presented without principled justification, when they are tailored to exclude inconvenient results, or when the question, "What would satisfy you?" has no coherent answer. A fair interlocutor can say, "Here are the criteria I need and why," and stick to them or transparently revise them for principled reasons. A mover of goalposts will not. If you encounter the tactic, practical responses help restore clarity. Reiterate the original standard and ask for a specific, non-ad hoc justification for any new requirement. Request that the challenger state, in advance, what evidence would count as sufficient. If they cannot, point out that the demand is unfalsifiable. Propose objective, pre-agreed tests, independent verification, or incremental thresholds so that progress can be measured. Calmly calling attention to the rule shifting, by saying, for example, when you asked for X, I provided X, now you are asking for Y, why is Y relevant? Exposes the maneuver and returns the conversation to honest terms. Left unchecked, moving the goalposts corrodes trust and makes productive disagreement impossible. It rewards bad faith and teaches interlocutors that changing the rules is a viable strategy. In contrast, good argumentation rests on fixed, explicit standards for evidence and a willingness to update beliefs when those standards are met. Calling out and resisting goalpost shifting is therefore not mere quibbling, it is a defense of rational discourse itself. Naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy is the mistake of treating descriptive facts about the world, what is, as if they by themselves established normative truths, what ought to be. In moral philosophy, the term is most closely associated with G. E. Moore, who argued in Principia Ethica, 1903, that good cannot be analytically reduced to any natural property such as pleasure, desire, satisfaction, evolutionary fitness, or anything measurable or observable. Moore's point is that if you try to define good as some natural property N, it remains sensible to ask, but is N really good? That open question shows that the word good has a conceptual bite that isn't exhausted by the natural description. The definition hasn't done the work of converting a fact into a value. This is related to, but not identical with, David Hume's famous point that you can't deduce an ought from mere is. Hume warned that arguments which jump straight from descriptions of the world to prescriptive conclusions are logically defective unless they smuggle in a bridging normative premise. Moore emphasizes a slightly different worry. Attempts to define moral terms by pointing to natural properties collapse the meaning of the moral term and evade the substantive question about value. Both concerns highlight the same basic worry. Facts alone don't generate reasons to act unless you accept some independent evaluative premise linking those facts to a value judgment. People commonly encounter the error in everyday talk and in public debate. Saying, this behavior is natural, therefore it is morally acceptable, is a typical appeal to nature that rests on the same implicit confusion, conflating descriptive normality with moral endorsement. Saying, pleasure is what's good, so whatever produces pleasure is morally good, is an example of trying to identify goodness with a natural state. Moore would ask why the mere production of pleasure should settle the question of goodness rather than leave it open for further scrutiny. Scientific facts about evolutionary origins, biological tendencies, or social patterns can inform our understanding of causes and consequences, but they do not by themselves justify value-laden prescriptions. Philosophers have debated and criticized Moore's claim. Moral naturalists maintain that moral properties can be natural properties and that the concept of good can be analyzed in empirical terms. Utilitarians, for instance, equate the good with pleasure or well-being. Defenders of naturalism argue that Moore's open question move begs the question by assuming a non-naturalist conception of good. Others reply that even if moral concepts have some naturalistic content, we still need explicit normative premises to bridge facts to duties in practical reasoning. In practical argument, the safest move is to be explicit about the normative step. If you want to argue from a fact to an obligation, make clear the evaluative premise that connects them. For example, if X causes large-scale suffering, and causing suffering is wrong, then we ought to prevent X. That shows the structure. Descriptive premises supply relevant facts, normative premises supply the value judgments that justify ought. Avoid treating descriptive claims as silent moral warrants. Science and observation can tell us what will happen if we act, but not whether we ought to act without adding a value-based reason. Recognizing that distinction is the simplest way to sidestep the naturalistic fallacy. No true Scotsman. The no true Scotsman fallacy is a form of circular reasoning that occurs when someone tries to protect a generalization from counterexamples by arbitrarily redefining the criteria to exclude them. Instead of revising a universal claim in light of contradictory evidence, the arguer moves the goalposts, insisting that the counterexample does not count because it does not meet some newly invented or subjective standard of true membership. This tactic creates the illusion that the original assertion remains unchallenged, when in reality the claim is being shielded from scrutiny rather than justified through evidence or reasoning. The name of the fallacy comes from an illustrative example. One person claims, "No Scotsman puts sugar in his porridge." When confronted with a Scotsman who does exactly that, the response is, "Well, no true Scotsman puts sugar in his porridge." The counterexample is dismissed not because it is irrelevant or mistaken, but because the definition of Scotsman is being retroactively narrowed to protect the original assertion. The core problem is that the definition of membership is shifted ad hoc to avoid falsification, making the argument unfalsifiable and logically uninformative. This fallacy is common whenever identity, purity, or moral character is invoked to defend a generalization. For instance, someone might claim, "No real environmentalist drives a gas-powered car," and when shown evidence of an environmentalist who does, respond, "Well, no true environmentalist would." The structure of the argument treats the initial generalization as sacred and shields it from exceptions, instead of engaging with reality. The result is an argumentative sleight of hand. The claim appears immune to criticism because any contradiction is dismissed as irrelevant, but this immunity is artificially created rather than justified. Psychologically, the no true Scotsman fallacy often emerges from a desire to maintain a coherent worldview or group identity. People are uncomfortable with exceptions that undermine their generalizations, especially when those generalizations relate to moral, ideological, or cultural categories. By redefining the group to exclude inconvenient cases, the arguer preserves a sense of purity or consistency at the cost of honesty and logical rigor. Recognizing this fallacy involves looking for shifts in definition that occur after the presentation of counterexamples. A red flag is the sudden introduction of true, real, or authentic as a qualifier in response to a disconfirming instance. Instead of engaging with the evidence, the argument substitutes a semantic maneuver that renders the claim impervious to challenge. Avoiding the fallacy requires either revising generalizations to account for exceptions or clearly defining categories in advance rather than manipulating definitions retroactively to protect a claim. In essence, the no true Scotsman fallacy protects beliefs from falsification by redefining terms rather than providing supporting evidence. It substitutes semantic gymnastics for reasoning, allowing a generalization to appear unassailable while ignoring the reality of counterexamples. Texas sharpshooter. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy is a mistake of reasoning that happens when someone takes a scatter of data, notices a cluster or pattern after the fact, and then treats that cluster as if it were a meaningful discovery all along. The name comes from the image of a marksman who fires at the side of a barn and then paints a target around the tightest group of bullet holes, claiming perfect aim. In argument and analysis, the same sleight of hand occurs. The target, the pattern, subgroup, or category, is defined after the data are looked at, and then that post hoc pattern is presented as if it were an independently predicted effect. What makes it fallacious is selection bias and a confusion between hypothesis generation and hypothesis testing. If you examine lots of variables, subgroups, time periods, or locations, purely by chance some of those slices are likely to show unusually high or low values. Treating one of those chance excursions as evidence of a real effect without accounting for how many other comparisons were examined inflates the risk of a false positive. In statistical terms, the more targets you tacitly allow, the more likely you are to hit something just by randomness, without adjustment or independent confirmation. The hit is indistinguishable from noise. The fallacy shows up everywhere, in dubious health headlines that trumpet a benefit found only in a tiny subgroup after dozens of analyses, in purported crime hotspots that are selected after mapping thousands of addresses, in miracle cures identified by fishing through many symptoms, or in investors hyping a winning trade while ignoring the thousands of losing ones. It's closely related to p-hacking and data dredging in science and to confirmation bias in everyday thought, the temptation to notice and remember hits while forgetting misses. That said, exploratory pattern finding is not inherently bad. Looking for interesting anomalies can generate useful hypotheses. The problem arises when an exploratory observation is promoted as confirmed evidence. Good practice separates the two stages: use exploration to suggest hypotheses, then test those hypotheses on new, independent data or by pre-specifying the analysis. Statistically, techniques such as corrections for multiple comparisons, cross-validation, holdout samples, or pre-registration can help prevent accidental bullseyes from being mistaken for reliable effects. To evaluate a suspicious claim, ask whether the pattern was predicted in advance, how many comparisons were tried before the pattern was reported, whether adjustments for multiple testing were made, and whether independent replication exists. If the claim depends on oddly specific categories, shifting boundaries, or post hoc subgrouping, be especially wary. A genuine effect will usually survive a clean, pre-specified test and replicate in fresh data. A Texas sharpshooter finding rarely does. In short, the fallacy is storytelling with statistics. Compelling narratives are easy to carve out of random scatter if you're free to draw the target wherever you like. Curiosity and pattern detection are useful, but intellectual honesty demands that post hoc discoveries be labeled as tentative and subjected to rigorous, independent confirmation before they're treated as proof. Appeal to consequences. An appeal to consequences, argumentum ad consequentiam, is a mistake in reasoning that treats the desirability or undesirability of a belief's outcomes as evidence for the belief's truth or falsity. In its simplest form it says, if X were true, bad things would follow, so X must be false, or, if X were true, good things would follow, so X must be true. The error lies in confusing two separate questions: what is the case, and what would happen if it were the case. Whether a proposition leads to pleasant or unpleasant consequences says nothing about whether that proposition is actually true. This fallacy is everywhere because consequences feel relevant and emotionally powerful. People instinctively resist beliefs that imply catastrophe and gravitate toward beliefs that comfort them. A politician might argue that a policy can't be true because it would wreck the economy, or a religious apologist might insist a doctrine must be true because denying it would make life meaningless. Rhetorically, the appeal to consequences shifts the debate from assessing evidence to manipulating emotions and practical fears, which can be enormously persuasive even though it is logically irrelevant to the truth of the claim. It's important to separate two legitimate but distinct uses of consequences. Consequences are absolutely relevant when we decide what to do. The likely outcomes of believing or acting on a claim properly inform policy, ethics, and personal choices. If a hypothesis, when acted on, would be catastrophically risky, prudence may advise caution regardless of whether the hypothesis is true. Likewise, empirical science uses predicted consequences as testable implications. If a claim predicts observation Y and we do observe Y, that observation becomes evidence in favor of the claim. But these are pragmatic or evidential concerns, not the simple rhetorical move of declaring a belief true or false because its consequences would be desirable or horrible. In other words, consequences can inform action and can provide evidence when tied to observation, but they do not by themselves determine truth. To counter the fallacy, return the conversation to evidence and reasons that bear directly on the proposition. Ask what independent data, logic, or observations support the claim, and separate discussion of what we should do if the claim were true from whether the claim actually is true. Recognizing the appeal to consequences helps keep debates honest. It exposes when someone is arguing from fear or wishful thinking rather than from facts. Appeal to novelty. The appeal to novelty fallacy occurs when something is claimed to be better, more correct, or more valuable simply because it is new or recently developed. This reasoning assumes that the passage of time naturally brings improvement, as if novelty itself guarantees progress or superiority. While new ideas and innovations can indeed be beneficial, the fact that something is recent does not automatically make it better. It must still be evaluated on its own merits, evidence, and practical outcomes. This fallacy is common in marketing, technology, and cultural trends. For instance, an advertisement might imply that a new model of a phone is superior to last year's simply because it is the latest release, without offering meaningful improvements beyond cosmetic changes. In politics or social debates, a policy might be promoted as modern or forward-thinking without any real proof that it is more effective than older alternatives. The core flaw lies in treating novelty as a substitute for actual evidence of quality, functionality, or correctness. The appeal to novelty works because people often associate new with progress, innovation, and advancement. Societies that value change and growth may be particularly susceptible to the idea that what is recent is automatically superior to what is established. However, novelty can just as easily bring untested flaws, unintended consequences, or superficial changes that do not improve substance. Likewise, what is older is not necessarily worse, it may have been refined and proven over time. Avoiding this fallacy requires resisting the urge to equate freshness with quality. A sound judgment compares the new option against the old based on relevant criteria such as evidence, performance, ethics, and cost. Just as age alone is not proof of value, recency alone cannot serve as evidence of superiority. In essence, the appeal to novelty fallacy mistakes newness for inherent improvement. While innovation can lead to genuine advancements, the worth of any new idea, product, or practice must be judged by its substance, not by the mere fact that it has only just appeared. Bandwagon fallacy. The bandwagon fallacy, also known as the appeal to popularity, occurs when someone argues that a claim must be true or a course of action must be correct simply because many people believe it or are doing it. Instead of evaluating the evidence, reasoning, or merits of the claim itself, the argument relies on the sheer number of adherents as a proxy for truth. This type of reasoning plays on social instincts and the human desire to belong, making it especially persuasive in contexts where conformity and group approval are valued, yet it provides no logical guarantee that the majority view is actually correct. The fallacy is common in advertising, politics, and everyday conversation. Commercials often suggest that a product is worthwhile because millions of customers can't be wrong, implying that popularity alone validates quality. Political or social arguments may insist that a policy is justified because everyone supports it, sidestepping careful consideration of its consequences or ethical implications. The underlying flaw is that truth and correctness are independent of consensus. Widespread belief does not ensure accuracy, just as an unpopular opinion may nonetheless be true. Historical examples abound. Flat Earth theories, geocentric cosmology, and Prohibition-era policies all enjoyed mass support at certain times, yet were demonstrably false or misguided. The appeal to popularity is particularly insidious because it exploits social proof, a psychological phenomenon in which people look to the behavior or opinions of others to determine what is acceptable or reasonable. This can create self-reinforcing cycles. As more people adopt a belief, others are inclined to follow, giving the impression of legitimacy. However, the mere fact that many people endorse a proposition tells us nothing about its objective validity. Proper evaluation requires independent reasoning, empirical evidence, and logical consistency rather than tallying votes or counting participants. Critically examining an argument for bandwagon reasoning involves separating the number of adherents from the quality of the claim. One should ask whether the popularity provides any actual evidence of truth or whether it merely signals social pressure, tradition, or cultural momentum. Recognizing this fallacy helps prevent blind conformity and encourages evaluation based on merit rather than mass opinion. In practical terms, a popular belief might serve as a heuristic for further investigation, but it cannot substitute for reasoned justification. Accepting a claim solely because everyone believes it is a shortcut that bypasses critical thinking, leaving one vulnerable to error and manipulation. In essence, the bandwagon fallacy conflates acceptance with correctness. Just because an idea is widespread does not make it valid, and careful reasoning demands that we examine claims on their own evidence rather than their social popularity. Fallacy of the single cause. The fallacy of the single cause is a mistake in reasoning where a complex event or outcome is attributed to just one cause, ignoring the many other factors that may have contributed. It oversimplifies reality by assuming that if something happened, there must be one decisive reason behind it, when in truth most events, especially in human affairs, science, and history, are the result of multiple, interacting causes. This kind of reasoning is appealing because it offers a clean, straightforward story, but it distorts the truth by leaving out important parts of the picture. You can see this fallacy in political arguments when someone claims that a country's economic decline is solely due to the policies of one leader, without considering the roles of global markets, technological changes, demographic shifts, or natural disasters. In everyday conversation, a student might say they failed a test because the teacher hates me, overlooking other possibilities like inadequate study, unclear instructions, personal stress, or test difficulty. The same pattern appears in public debates over health issues, for example, blaming one ingredient in the diet for all cases of obesity, when factors like exercise habits, genetics, socioeconomic conditions, and lifestyle also play significant roles. The reasoning error here is not simply pointing to a cause, but treating it as the only cause without justification. Sometimes a single factor can indeed dominate an outcome, like flipping the wrong switch causing a machine to stop, but such cases are rarer than they seem. More often, events emerge from the interplay of many influences, and isolating one as the sole explanation is misleading. The danger is that it not only misrepresents the truth but also leads to poor decision-making. If we believe there is only one cause, we may target only that in our solutions, ignoring other necessary changes. Part of what fuels this fallacy is a human preference for simple narratives. We like clear villains and heroes, single turning points, and tidy explanations. Complex causality, with its web of contributing factors, feels less satisfying and harder to communicate. But reality tends to be tangled, and good reasoning requires resisting the urge to oversimplify. Avoiding the fallacy of the single cause means asking whether the explanation accounts for all the relevant evidence and whether other factors might also have contributed. It means being open to multi-causal reasoning, even when it complicates the story. In truth, most events are the product of many influences working together: social, economic, psychological, environmental, and ignoring that complexity makes our understanding incomplete and our conclusions unreliable. Middle ground fallacy. The middle ground fallacy occurs when it is assumed that the truth or best solution must lie somewhere between two opposing positions simply because it is the compromise between them. This reasoning treats the middle point as inherently more reasonable or correct without examining whether it is supported by evidence or logic. While compromise can be useful in resolving disputes, the mere fact that a position is between two extremes does not make it valid, practical, or moral. This fallacy often appears in debates where opposing views are presented as equally valid, even when one is factually incorrect or unsupported. For example, if one person claims the Earth is flat and another claims it is spherical, concluding that it must be shaped like a slightly flattened oval would not be more accurate simply because it is a midpoint between the two positions. Similarly, if one group advocates complete abolition of a harmful practice and another insists on maintaining it unchanged, the compromise position of partially keeping it may still perpetuate serious harm. The flaw lies in assuming that truth is always evenly distributed between conflicting claims. The middle ground fallacy appeals to people because it seems fair, balanced, and diplomatic. In many areas of life, compromise is indeed a valuable social tool for reducing conflict and finding mutually acceptable solutions. However, when applied to matters of fact, morality, or safety, that split the difference approach can lead to illogical or even dangerous conclusions. Sometimes one side is simply wrong, and the correct answer lies entirely with one position, not in a manufactured midpoint. Recognizing this fallacy requires examining each position on its own merits rather than assuming the most reasonable answer is automatically in between. Evidence, logic, and real-world consequences should determine the validity of a claim, not the desire for symmetry between opposing sides. In essence, the middle ground fallacy confuses compromise with correctness. While the middle path may feel balanced, it is not inherently truer or better simply because it is halfway between two extremes. Truth and sound reasoning are determined by facts and logic, not by averaging opinions. Moralistic fallacy. The moralistic fallacy is a form of flawed reasoning in which someone assumes that because something ought to be a certain way, it is that way in reality. It confuses moral ideals or values with factual descriptions, letting our sense of how the world should work dictate what we believe about how it actually works. At its core, it treats ethical or normative judgments as if they were evidence of empirical truth, blurring the line between is and ought. This kind of thinking often appears in discussions about human behavior, biology, and social structures. For example, a person might argue that violence can't be a natural part of human nature, because violence is wrong, or that discrimination must not exist anymore, because everyone should be treated equally. In each case, the belief that something is undesirable or morally unacceptable is used as a reason to claim that it does not occur or is not part of reality. Similarly, in public policy debates, someone might reject findings about health risks or economic patterns simply because accepting them would conflict with their sense of justice or fairness. The appeal of the moralistic fallacy lies in its comforting alignment between our values and our picture of reality. It is pleasant to believe that the world conforms to our moral expectations, that what is good is also true, and what is bad simply doesn't exist. But this approach can lead to wishful thinking, denial of unpleasant truths, and a reluctance to confront problems that need solving. If we refuse to acknowledge realities that clash with our ideals, we lose the ability to address them effectively. Avoiding the moralistic fallacy requires keeping descriptive claims and normative claims separate. Recognizing that something is the case does not mean we approve of it, and acknowledging something is wrong does not mean it cannot exist. Good reasoning begins with an honest assessment of facts as they are, followed by a discussion of what should be done about them. This separation allows us to work toward moral goals without distorting our understanding of the world to fit our ideals. In essence, the moralistic fallacy replaces clear-eyed observation with moral hopefulness, letting should shape our picture of is. While values are essential for guiding action, they cannot by themselves tell us the truth about reality, and mistaking them for evidence leaves us unprepared to deal with the world as it actually is. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. Post hoc ergo propter hoc is a Latin phrase meaning, after this, therefore because of this. It names a common error in reasoning where someone infers a causal connection simply because one event follows another in time. The problem is that temporal sequence, becoming after a, is a necessary condition for A to cause B, but it is not sufficient. Many things can happen in sequence by coincidence, common circumstances, or through intermediate causes, so jumping from A happened before B to A caused B short-circuits careful inquiry. The mistake shows up in everyday life and in public debate. A person might assume their lucky charm caused a good outcome because the charm was present before success, or a town might credit a new mayor for falling crime rates without checking whether crime trends were already declining, whether reporting changed, or whether other policies or economic factors explain the change. Sometimes two things move together because of a third factor. Ice cream sales and drownings both rise in summer, but one does not cause the other. Other times random variation and regression to the mean make extreme outcomes follow interventions even when the intervention had no effect. Confusing correlation or sequence with causation leads to wrong decisions because it treats coincidence or confounding as proof. What turns a temporal observation into a credible causal claim is not merely order but evidence of a mechanism, an explanation for how and why A would produce B, plus consideration of alternate explanations and counterfactuals, what would have happened had A not occurred. Good causal inference asks whether we can rule out common causes, whether the relationship replicates in other settings, whether varying A changes B in predictable ways, and whether controlled comparisons, natural experiments, randomized trials, or well-designed observational studies support the causal story. Without those checks, the post hoc leap remains a rhetorical trick rather than a sound justification. Psychologically, people are prone to this fallacy because humans seek patterns and simple stories. It's often easier and more satisfying to tell a single cause narrative than to wrestle with multi-causal complexity and uncertainty. Politicians and pundits sometimes exploit this tendency, offering neat before-after narratives to claim credit or assign blame. The way to resist the error is practical: ask for evidence beyond timing, propose plausible alternative causes, look for corroborating data from different samples or methods, and prefer explanations that specify mechanisms and have predictive power rather than explanations that rest solely on sequence. In short, noticing that one thing followed another is the start of causal investigation, not its end. Treat temporal order as an invitation to test a hypothesis rather than as proof of one, and you'll avoid mistaking coincidence, confounding, or coincidence dressed as causation for genuine cause and effect. 2 quoque. The 2 quoque fallacy, Latin for you too, occurs when someone attempts to discredit an argument or accusation by pointing out that the person making it is guilty of the same behavior or holds a similar flaw. Instead of addressing the substance of the claim, the focus shifts to the perceived hypocrisy of the speaker. The fallacy assumes that because the arguer is inconsistent, their argument is invalid, which is logically mistaken. The truth or falsity of a claim is independent of the person presenting it. This fallacy often appears in moral, ethical, or behavioral debates. For example, if one person says, "You shouldn't lie," and the other responds, "Well, you lied last week," the response sidesteps the moral question itself. The fact that the first person may be hypocritical does not prove that lying is permissible or that the original claim about honesty is false. Similarly, in political discourse, one politician might dismiss criticism of a policy by pointing to the critic's past decisions, effectively shifting attention from the policy's merits to the critic's behavior. While pointing out hypocrisy can have rhetorical impact, it does not constitute evidence against the argument itself. The 2 quoque fallacy thrives on human sensitivity to fairness and inconsistency. People are naturally inclined to react strongly when someone appears to violate their own standards, which can make this tactic emotionally persuasive even when it is logically irrelevant. However, conflating personal behavior with the validity of a claim undermines critical thinking. It treats the messenger as inseparable from the message and ignores independent evaluation of the argument's reasoning or evidence. Detecting the fallacy involves observing whether the response addresses the actual content of the argument or merely accuses the speaker of inconsistency. A legitimate challenge would engage with the reasons, evidence, or principles underlying the claim, not merely point to the speaker's past actions. For instance, questioning the practicality of honesty in certain circumstances or presenting evidence about consequences would be relevant, whereas highlighting the speaker's own lapses is not. Ultimately, the 2 quoque fallacy distracts from rational discussion by substituting personal attack or perceived hypocrisy for substantive critique. While calling out hypocrisy may be socially or morally relevant, it does nothing to prove or disprove the truth of an argument. The validity of a claim rests on its logic and evidence, not on the consistency or moral record of the person making it. Cherry picking. Cherry picking is a fallacy in which someone selectively presents only the evidence that supports their position while ignoring or omitting evidence that would challenge or weaken it. The name comes from the image of picking only the ripest, most appealing cherries from a tree while leaving the rest behind. In reasoning, this creates a misleading picture, because the audience sees only the favorable data points and is led to believe they represent the whole truth. The flaw lies in distorting the evidential landscape. Every claim exists in a broader context of mixed evidence, some for, some against. If you highlight only confirming data and filter out the inconvenient counterexamples, you can make almost any position look plausible. This is why cherry picking is so persuasive. It feels like an argument based on facts, but those facts are really a curated slice chosen to produce a specific impression. In effect, the reasoning has been edited for bias. Cherry-picking often appears in debates over science, politics, and economics, where data sets are large and nuanced. A politician might boast about a single year's strong job growth while ignoring the surrounding years of decline. A climate change skeptic might point to one unusually cold winter as proof that global warming isn't happening, while disregarding the decades-long warming trend. In advertising, a supplement manufacturer might quote a single positive study while omitting dozens of inconclusive or negative ones. By narrowing the frame, the speaker sidesteps the full body of evidence. Cognitively, this fallacy plays into confirmation bias, the human tendency to notice and recall information that agrees with our existing beliefs. People rarely experience all the evidence firsthand, they rely on sources to provide it. If those sources themselves cherry-pick, the audience may never realize how incomplete the picture is. This is why cherry-picking can be unintentional. Someone might sincerely believe they've seen all the facts simply because they've only ever been shown the ones that fit the preferred narrative. Not all selective use of evidence is fallacious. In a focused argument, it's normal to cite examples or studies that illustrate your point. The problem arises when you imply that your selection is the whole or representative picture, while knowingly omitting relevant contradictory evidence. Sound reasoning requires acknowledging the existence of counter-evidence and addressing it directly, even if you ultimately argue that it carries less weight than the supporting data. The antidote to cherry-picking is intellectual honesty and methodological completeness. When assessing a claim, ask, what evidence is missing? Are there credible data or examples that point the other way? If you looked at all the evidence, supportive and unsupportive, would the conclusion still hold? By refusing to look only at the ripest cherries, you replace the illusion of strength with a genuine, well-balanced argument that can withstand scrutiny. Nirvana fallacy. The Nirvana fallacy occurs when a realistic solution is dismissed simply because it is not perfect, or when an idealized, flawless alternative is held up as the only acceptable standard. This type of reasoning compares practical options to an unattainable ideal rather than to other realistic possibilities, making anything less than perfection seem inadequate or unworthy of adoption. While striving for improvement is valuable, demanding perfection before accepting a solution can lead to inaction or the rejection of meaningful progress. This fallacy often appears in debates about policy, technology, and social change. For example, someone might oppose renewable energy because it can't supply 100% of our power needs all the time, or reject a new safety measure because it won't prevent every single accident. In such cases, the focus is placed on what the solution cannot do, rather than on the significant benefits it could provide compared to the current situation. The underlying error is treating the absence of perfection as evidence of failure, ignoring the fact that partial solutions can still produce substantial improvements. The appeal of the Nirvana fallacy lies in the human tendency to envision ideal outcomes and compare reality to them. While this can inspire innovation, it can also foster unrealistic expectations and hinder pragmatic decision-making. By setting perfection as the baseline, all real-world solutions inevitably appear deficient, even if they are vastly better than the status quo or the alternatives available. Avoiding this fallacy requires recognizing that in most practical matters, trade-offs are inevitable and that improvement should be judged relative to realistic options, not flawless ideals. Progress often comes through incremental steps, and imperfect solutions can pave the way for greater achievements in the future. In essence, the Nirvana fallacy confuses the unattainable ideal with the necessary standard, dismissing good solutions simply because they are not perfect. Sound reasoning evaluates ideas in the context of what is realistically possible, understanding that partial progress is still progress. Appeal to authority. An appeal to authority, often called argumentum ad verecundium, treats the endorsement of a person or group as decisive evidence for a claim instead of engaging the actual reasons or data. At its core, the error is substituting reputation for argument. Because someone deemed important, knowledgeable, or famous says X, we are urged to accept X without examining the supporting evidence. That shortcut can be useful in everyday life. Most of us accept medical advice from a qualified physician rather than redoing the research ourselves, but it becomes a fallacy when authority is invoked in place of argument, when the authority is not an appropriate expert in the relevant domain, or when the authority's claim is presented as unquestionable rather than as a proposition supported by reasons. Not every appeal to an authority is illegitimate. Expert testimony matters when the authority is genuinely knowledgeable about the topic, when they provide reasons or evidence, and when their views are corroborated by evidence or by a consensus of competent peers. The fallacy appears when one relies solely on a single name brand endorsement, on celebrities who lack relevant expertise, on vague references to experts say, or on isolated authorities who are contradicted by the bulk of evidence. It also becomes suspect when the authority has clear conflicts of interest, financial, ideological, or institutional, that could bias their judgment. In short, authority can be a helpful clue that a claim is worth taking seriously, but it is not a substitute for argument. The appeal to authority is tempting because people are cognitive economizers. We cannot personally verify every technical claim, so we rely on trusted sources. This is reasonable only if the trust is calibrated, if the source is an expert in the right discipline, if the claim falls within the scope of their expertise, and if their assertion is supported by methods and evidence that others can check. Problems arise when authority is treated as definitive even on matters outside the authority's competence, when the argument ignores counter-evidence, or when the statement is framed as, because X said so, instead of, here is X's evidence and reasoning. You can recognize a fallacious appeal to authority by watching for certain moves, heavy reliance on a named person or institution without presentation of the underlying reasons, vague references like, experts agree, without specification or citation, or the dismissal of counterarguments on the basis that, the authorities say otherwise. The presence of credentials alone does not settle truth. Credentials increase the probability that a claim is informed, but they do not eliminate the need for independent support. Likewise, a consensus among qualified specialists is stronger evidence than a lone authority, but even consensus can be overturned by new data, so it should be treated as strong but revisable evidence rather than as an article of faith. When you encounter an appeal to authority, practical responses help avoid both gullibility and impractical skepticism. Ask whether the authority is speaking within their area of expertise and whether they provide evidence or only an assertion. Check whether other competent authorities concur and whether there are transparent methods or data you can inspect indirectly, reviews, studies, reproducible results. Be alert to conflicts of interest and to rhetorical devices that present authority as unchallengeable. If you must rely on authority because you lack specialist knowledge, treat that reliance as provisional. Accept the claim tentatively while remaining open to revision if independent evidence or more authoritative analysis emerges. An appeal to authority becomes problematic when it short-circuits inquiry and turns reputation into a veto against questioning. Used well, critically, transparently, and alongside evidence, deference to expertise is a practical necessity in complex worlds. Used badly, it shields weak claims from scrutiny and substitutes prestige for proof. Appeal to hypocrisy without relevance. An appeal to hypocrisy without relevance is a flawed move in argument where, instead of addressing the substance of another person's claim, you point out that the person has acted in a way inconsistent with that claim, even though that inconsistency has no bearing on whether the claim itself is true or false. This is a specific misuse of the tu quoque, you too, response. It shifts attention from the argument's merits to the speaker's behavior, hoping to undermine credibility by exposing a double standard. The error lies in treating the messenger's hypocrisy as if it refuted the message, when in fact the two issues are logically separate. The classic shape of this fallacy is, you say people should recycle, but I've seen you throw plastic in the trash, so your argument is wrong. The hypocrisy may be real, but whether or not the person follows their own advice doesn't change the truth of the statement that recycling benefits the environment. In this way, the fallacy functions as a diversion. Instead of engaging with the evidence or reasoning behind a claim, it replaces that engagement with a charge of inconsistency, which might embarrass the speaker but leaves the claim untouched. The "without relevance" part matters because there are contexts where pointing out hypocrisy is relevant, namely, when the discussion is about trust, character, or the speaker's personal reliability. For example, if someone is running for office on an anti-corruption platform but is caught taking bribes, the hypocrisy is directly relevant to their suitability for that role. But when the topic is the truth of a factual claim, the logic of a moral principle, or the strength of a policy proposal, the speaker's failure to live up to their own standard is beside the point. The claim's validity depends on evidence and reasoning, not on the claimant's personal consistency. Psychologically, this fallacy works because hypocrisy is easy to spot and emotionally satisfying to call out. Exposing a contradiction feels like a win, especially in adversarial debates, because it undermines the opponent's moral authority. But truth isn't a popularity contest, and moral authority isn't a shortcut to correctness. Even the most hypocritical person can make an accurate statement, a corrupt judge can still rule correctly on a point of law, and a smoker can truthfully tell someone that smoking causes cancer. The antidote to this fallacy is to separate two questions: is the claim true? And is the person who made it consistent in word and deed? If the discussion is about the first, the second is a distraction unless it reveals bias or conflicts of interest that affect the evidence. When the hypocrisy has no direct bearing on the claim's truth, pointing it out may score rhetorical points, but it does not logically undermine the argument. Honest reasoning demands that we address the argument on its own terms, even when the person making it fails to follow it themselves.